Hi everyone, I'm Nicole and I'm on the EAAG board. EAAG is working together with Unity Council to talk about some of the recent anti-Asian violence and some of the topics that are helpful in understanding some of these recent events.
Thanks, Nicole. So as many UC events go, we always start with discussion norms. There's going to be some discussion in advisories after this kind of presentation. So the first discussion norm is don't be afraid to be raggedy. You don't need to have perfect phrasing, just be authentic. Yes, the next one is be sensitive to the experience of others. So understand that you may not be completely educated on the subject and try to understand what other people tell you and also be sensitive of your own language. Understand how your words can hurt others while simultaneously don't be afraid to make mistakes. And then finally, speak from the I perspective. Speak from things you know and don't try to speak from a perspective which you don't experience.
Also, in the advisory discussion, make sure that you establish that everything that happens in your advisory should stay there. And that just really helps to create this sense of a safe space and make sure that everyone feels comfortable. Then don't be afraid to ask questions after you leave. You might have a lot of questions or have heard things that you didn't know about, but just be mindful of your language and of what you're asking. Especially of your friends who may be part of a minority culture. So for example, don't ask about specific facts that you could just look up online because this puts a pressure on people to have to be a representative for their race or their background when they aren't necessarily ready for that type of pressure. So instead focus on personal feelings or anecdotes, but then ask in a way that doesn't force anyone to educate you or that gives them the freedom to not give an answer or to not have to be overly vulnerable if they're not comfortable with that.
So we're first gonna start off with a couple of trivia questions. So advisors, feel free to stop the video for a couple seconds after each question is asked in order to allow time for advisees to answer.
All right, so for the first question is, what does AAPI stand for? So when the acronym AAPI is used, it is used to refer to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. In addition to this, there are different variations, such as one where an additional A is added to refer to Asians, or when an SA is added to refer to South Asians.
Next, what year was the Chinese Exclusion Act? This is actually a trick question. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed twice. It was first passed in 1882 and then renewed in 1902. This act was the first major law that placed a nationality-based restriction on immigration to the United States. It banned Chinese immigration for more than 60 years and was not repealed until 1943 by the Magnuson Act. However, no large-scale immigration from Asian countries was permitted until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965.
All right, so the next question is, who is Vincent Chin? So the correct answer is A. In 1982, Vincent Chin, a 27-year-old Chinese-American draftsman, was harassed in Detroit by two white men who wrongfully blamed Chin for the Japanese taking their auto industry jobs. After harassing them, the men repeatedly smashed Chin with a baseball bat, causing him to die 4 years later. However, both men were only given 3 years of probation and a $3,000 fine, as the judge in charge of the case claimed that Vincent Chin's murderers, as I quote, weren't the kind of men you send to jail. The sentence outraged the Asian American community, which resulted in them uniting across ethnic lines and working for civil rights.
The next question is, what was People versus Hall? In the 1850s, California court convicted a man named George Hall of the murder of a Chinese miner named Ling Sing based on the testimony of Chinese witnesses. Hall appealed this verdict, citing existing legislation that barred Black and brown people from testifying against white people. The California Supreme Court sided with Hall and officially ruled that people of Asian descent could not testify against a white person in court, virtually guaranteeing that white people could escape punishment for anti-Asian violence. Hall walked free, and the law was only repealed in 1873.
Are xenophobia and racism the same? No. Although they are similar, they are different enough that it is possible for one to be both xenophobic and racist. On one hand, xenophobia is the fear and hatred of strangers or foreigners, whereas racism has a broader meaning set, including a belief that racial differences produce the inherent superiority of a particular race.
We see that anti-Asian sentiment and violence isn't just limited to recent events. It's deeply rooted in American history. However, these incidents are often disregarded. This can be attributed in part to things like the model minority myth. What is the model minority myth? The term model minority is based in stereotypes and has often been used to present Asian Americans as law-abiding citizens who have achieved high levels of success, especially in a manner that contrasts with other minority groups. The selective projection of the stories of successful AAPI has been weaponized in order to further the pull yourself up by the bootstraps immigrant ideology. It conveys the idea to other minority groups that, hey, Asians can assimilate and succeed, so why can't you? At the same time, this myth erases Asians' status as people of color and the racism they have faced, in addition to painting AAPI as a monolith by ignoring the diverse experiences of the various ethnic groups under the AAPI umbrella. It's important to note that this is indeed a myth. We see that today, Asians have the largest income gap of any racial group, and they're actually the poorest racial group in New York City.
The term hate crime is something that you might have heard a lot recently. It's defined by the Oxford Dictionary as a crime, typically one involving violence that is motivated by prejudice on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, or other grounds. In practice, defining a hate crime is much more difficult. Legally and socially, proving the intent of the perpetrator is very difficult, especially in the case of beliefs that have no symbols or labels. The question of what is and isn't a hate crime was most evident recently with the Atlanta shootings. On March 16, 2021, a series of shootings occurred at the 3 spas in the Atlanta area, murdering 8 people, including 6 Asian women. First reports of the shootings refused to label it as a hate crime, instead attempting to place the blame on the shooter's sex addiction and claiming that there was no racial motive. Unfortunately, the legal constraints keep this crime from officially being called a hate crime. But in media and among the Atlanta and AAPI communities, the law and the police's report have been called into question. While the legal motives behind this crime are still under investigation, to much of the public, the implications are clear. Robert Long and his extreme violence on March 16th followed the increase of anti-Asian violence we've been seeing for the past few years. It has also led into a discussion of how the media has been treating anti-Asian violence and the AAPI community.
So from that definition of a hate crime, we can tell that it's very, very ambiguous. So there's a very, very large gray area when we discuss these issues. And that's why the number of hate crimes reported is drastically lower than it should be because of this huge gray area. And the media is really hesitant to classify something as a hate crime. And this only further contributes to this downplay of racism that Asian Americans experience, even though it was beyond clear that this shooting in Atlanta was racially motivated. And also Jay Baker, the Georgia sheriff, who made a statement that it was just a bad day for the shooter, was often covered in a lot of media outlets. And a lot of these media outlets just broadcasted this without A, pinpointing that it was wrong, or B, explaining why it was also racially motivated. So that's why this often gives the public this false impression that it's okay to make these excuses for a clearly racially motivated incident like this. And why is media representation and rhetoric so important? So the rhetoric used to describe Asian countries in a degrading way directly shapes people's mindsets of people who they believe to be from these countries. So with this in mind, oftentimes Asian Americans and immigrants bear the brunt of these biased media representations of these countries. And even beyond this, the media controls this extremely problematic, biased, and wrong narrative of Asia in general, whether it's subtle or super obvious, that Asian countries are often portrayed as barbaric and unsanitary. And this only fuels this idea of hate crimes, because rhetoric is absolutely everything. For example, last week in a New York Times article, a headline reads, "China has approved its 5th COVID-19 vaccine and it's made of hamster ovary cells." We need to keep in mind that hamster ovary cells are how labs all over the world make these proteins. They are universally used, and they were actually developed in a Boston lab in 1957. So this further perpetuates the narrative that Chinese people do weird things to animals and they're barbaric and unsanitary, similar to the false dog eating stereotype. Again, this mindset created by the media and basically the West to enforce white supremacism is further perpetuated. And whenever it benefits white supremacism, Asian people are called barbaric one day and then embraced as a model minority the next.
portrayal in news and media often relate to two stereotype dimensions, the fawn and the foe. The fawn stereotype stems from the model minority myth, where people of Asian descent are seen as non-aggressive, submissive, preservers of the status quo, and by extension, exoticized and fetishized. The faux stereotype, however, stems from the idea of the yellow peril, where people of Asian descent were viewed as threats, predators, spies, and the perpetual foreigner. These stereotypes, although completely wrong and unfounded, have been collectively internalized by Western society and have influenced the way we perceive and discuss history and current events. These two portrayals have become the underpinning of racial attitudes towards the AAPI community and the motive behind anti-Asian microaggressions and hate crimes, both of which have risen the past 2 to 4 years due to the rhetoric being used about COVID-19, China, and broader East Asia.
The most prominent example of this fawn stereotype is the fact that Asian American women are historically fetishized and sexualized in American culture, ingraining discriminatory norms and leaving AAPI women uniquely vulnerable to hate crimes. This looks like the Page Act of 1875, coming a few years before the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was enacted seemingly to restrict prostitution and forced labor. In reality, it was used to systematically prevent Chinese women from immigrating to the US under the pretense that they were prostitutes. This also looks like US servicemen overseas in the Philippine-American War, World War II, and the Vietnam War, in their history of soliciting sex workers, patronizing industries that encourage sex trafficking, and viewing Asian women as exotic sex objects. Asian women who entered the industry were then known as comfort women to these servicemen. The Atlanta shooter's self-proclaimed temptation speaks to these exact long-standing stereotypes about the Asian American woman who has been exoticized as sexual partners as far back as the 1880s. This is additionally a key way the unique intersection of racism and misogyny affects AAPI women.
The faux stereotype, while very prevalent now, has historically been in American history. Asians and Asian Americans have historically been feared as dangers to the Western world, often portrayed as villains such as Fu Manchu, with narrow slits as eyes and exaggerated yellow skin. Asian Americans, while deemed the model minority, are still treated as perpetual foreigners and not seen as a part of the American identity. Where did you come from? Or the follow-up, where did you really come from? Is an unfortunate but perpetual question asked of Asian Americans, despite having lived in America their whole lives. This otherness is especially highlighted in times of crisis, when Asians are scapegoated and blamed for the issue at hand. For example, COVID-19 pandemic. During this time, the rhetoric used by many major politicians, such as Kung Flu, China virus, Wuhan virus, have exacerbated this perception of the Asian foe and have sparked a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes across the US. Today, 1 in 4 Americans have seen someone blame Asian people for the coronavirus epidemic, according to USA Today. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, reports of anti-Asian hate crimes have risen to up to 150% in many large cities such as LA, Boston, and Seattle. In New York, anti-Asian hate crimes spiked to 933%. In the past year, about 3,800 incidents, mostly against women, of Asian Americans being verbally harassed, punched, kicked, burned, cut, and murdered have been reported. And unfortunately, due to underreporting, there are likely many more incidents that go unaddressed. Asian hate crime is not new. Its simmering has just come to a boil.
One of the biggest problems I see a lot is performative activism, or competitive wokeness, if you will. Many people are more concerned with looking like good people and appearing politically correct, rather than actually addressing issues and learning and growing. That isn't to say that they aren't fundamentally good people, or even that they don't believe that what they're saying in theory, but it's a lot of misplaced energy. It's counterproductive and can be really frustrating, especially if this performative awareness leads to the dismissal of actual minority voices and discussions. If your Asian friends tell you that something made them uncomfortable, or that something someone said felt racist, take the time to listen to them and see how you can learn from hearing their experience as an individual, rather than just offhandedly agreeing with them. If they're comfortable enough to tell you that you said something insensitive, then chances are they're not attacking your character, but rather they just want to improve your relationship and y'all's understanding of each other. They're trying to dismantle these really deeply ingrained racist ideas, starting with the people they're already comfortable talking to. If they don't say anything ever, think about why they're silent rather than just assuming that the Asians you know don't experience racism. In my experience, this silence is generally because of our past experiences with being unheard and not due to any specific issues with specific people. Lastly, if you are Asian and you don't feel like you experience racism, I hope that this video has helped you to think about why that is. Instead of focusing energy on posting cute infographics to your story, genuinely learn. In fact, these infographics are actually a really great place to start if you think about them within the context of your life rather than as these distant, abstract ideas. Other things you can do are to ask your Asian friends questions and have productive conversations. And as long as you make sure that you don't pressure them to speak for their entire community or pressure them to talk about more than they want to, you would learn a lot from that experience. If they happen to not have the energy, or if they don't have all the answers, which they probably won't have all the answers, you can do your own research on Asian American history and culture as well.
So now we're going to dig into how we can better improve how we deal with anti-Asian hate within the SJS community specifically. So the first thing we wanted to talk about was when addressing Asian culture and Asian history in class, it's really important to be aware of singling out Asian students and also assuming their ethnicity. For example, when you're unsure how to pronounce a word that may be in an Asian language, for example, Chinese, be conscious of assuming that a student who looks Asian will know how to pronounce it, and don't put them in an awkward position by asking them specifically and singling them out. Try to get more comfortable talking about and hearing about the struggles that Asian people face. Like Gabe mentioned, genuine care is better than silent, awkward, full eye contact side glances at the very few Asian people who may be in your class. And the next thing what we wanted to talk about was white-splaining the Asian experience. So this includes explaining what you believe a situation in an Asian country is from what you learn from the internet or TikTok, and then telling an Asian student that everything they know from their own experiences from that country is all wrong. And also this includes invalidating how Asian people interpret their own culture and confining them to a generalization that you may have about the Asian experience. Doing so makes people feel really isolated, and you make them feel not belonging.
Just like Deanne and Gabe told you, we'll be ending this advisory off with some calls to action, as well as discussion questions to really kickstart that conversation and move forward. So the first call to action is just to check in on your AAPI friends and make sure that they are okay during this time. The second is making conscious efforts to pronounce AAPI terms and names accurately without relying too much on AAPI friends to tell you so. The third is just to check your stereotypes and preconceptions about the AAPI community, and also don't be afraid to call out such prejudices when you hear them. The fourth is to donate to and/or volunteer with AAPI-centered organizations or community funds. And the fifth and final is just to read more on AAPI and minority history.
Thank you all so much for staying attentive throughout this presentation. And now we're going to have all of y'all discuss these two questions with your advisories. The first one is, what are ways we can mitigate and dismantle stereotypes and racism towards the AAPI community? And the second question is, how can we be more comfortable with discussing these issues?
Please let us know what Unity Council can do to better support AAPI students on campus. This can be done by going to sjsunitycouncil.com and searching in the search bar AAPI support.